post deadlines all the
Of
time.
course, but that's good to check off on.
But yeah, technically our SEA imposed deadline was yesterday.
Okay, I appreciate you letting
Because
me
I
know.
had to write some of the people in my session and was like, I need your votes.
Yeah, okay, let me double check and see if I missed the email. Thanks for letting me know.
Yeah, no problem.
Thank you guys for coming out tonight. So, this is one of the Probasco events, largely geared towards students, and tonight's event is going to be on Bitcoin. So our speaker is Will Luther. He is a professor of economics at Florida Atlantic University, director of the American Institute for Economic Research's Sound Money Project, and an adjunct scholar with Cato Institute's Center for Monetary and Financial Alternatives. Will's published more than 35 academic journal articles on macro topics ranging from monetary policy, Bitcoin, business cycles, and economic growth. His research has also been featured in The Economist, NPR, Wall Street Journal, Time, Forbes, Fortune, and many other impressive outlets. So please welcome Dr. Will Luther.
So, you're all here for a Bitcoin talk. Surely I don't need to tell you that the price of Bitcoin fluctuates a lot. So if we go back to December 2017, one Bitcoin was worth a little less than $20,000. You can't see here because we're running in protective mode, I guess. But last April, that was around $65,000. And as of today, 20 minutes before this talk, one Bitcoin was worth $51,365. This is a lot of volatility. The purchasing power of Bitcoin fluctuates a lot. Why is this? This is what we want to explain. Now, some folks like Steve Hanke, my friend at Johns Hopkins University, will say that this is all just a bubble, right? That Bitcoin it's really worth nothing. It's intrinsically worthless, which he then takes to mean it's totally worthless, which doesn't actually follow. And so all of this is just price movement that's eventually going to go to zero because Bitcoin is really worth nothing. On the other hand, if you're on Twitter, you might find folks like Nick Carter or Alex Gladstein who will say, no, this Bitcoin, it's going to the moon. It's worth a lot. It's an incredible technology. Of course, it's going to be very valuable in the future. And so what I want to do today is to find some range of reasonable between these two views. Is to give us some sense of thinking about this question. What is Bitcoin really worth? And how do we explain the fluctuation in the price of Bitcoin that we observe here in the time series? So you can judge whether I'm successful with that. Now, I recognize that in a room this size, people are starting off in very different places, and so I'm going to start with the very basics. Let's get a sense of what Bitcoin is and what's unique about Bitcoin, what it allows us to do that we couldn't do without Bitcoin, or at least couldn't do before Bitcoin was introduced. From there, we'll start to think about the fundamental value of Bitcoin. That is, what is Bitcoin really worth? And finally, we'll ask whether or not we can explain, or how I should say, we can go about explaining the fluctuation in the price that we observe. So what is Bitcoin? Bitcoin is an unbacked digital asset. It's a cryptocurrency. That means that you can use it to make and receive payments on the internet. Now, if you look closely here, you'll see that in the background, there are actually physical tokens here. But these aren't really Bitcoin. These are what journalists use to show you what Bitcoin is when they don't really know what Bitcoin is. In fact, there are some of these physical coins, and if you look very closely here, you'll see kind of a sparkle on some of these coins. It's actually a holographic seal. And if you were to peel back that holographic seal, you would find a digital address where that balance of Bitcoin is actually located. Now, don't peel back that digital address because, of course, if you see that digital address, you can transfer that balance to somewhere else. And so this token coin is then just a piece of metal that's not worth anything and won't command a premium anymore. So Bitcoin is digital. We're going to be using it to make and receive payments on the internet. And it's not really good for anything else. That is, it's the kind of money that economists would describe as being intrinsically worthless. Now that doesn't mean that it's totally worthless. It means it's worthless for anything except for functioning as a medium of exchange, a medium through which you exchange what you have for what you want. So it's not a commodity, it's not a good. You can't consume it in and of itself. It's not redeemable for anything else. So historical dollars in the US that were issued by banks are redeemable for gold, or in some cases silver. Bitcoin's not like that, it's not a redeemable claim. It's not like your Chase checking account balance, which is redeemable for dollars. No, it's just an outside money, much like the US dollar, that's not redeemable for anything else and can't really be used for anything else except for transferring value. Right? So that's what Bitcoin is. It's just a digital currency. But the interesting thing about Bitcoin, the novelty of Bitcoin, is what's under the hood. That is how it processes transactions. You see, Bitcoin is not just a currency, it's also a payments platform. It enables us to process transactions in a way that we weren't able to process transactions before Bitcoin existed. Now, I look around, I see all of your bright young faces, and I think, these folks, they don't look like nerdy economists like me who think about weird things like payment processing. So maybe you don't think very much when you make payments about that payment being processed, but every payment must be processed some way. Let's think about a cash transaction. So a cash transaction uses a decentralized clearing mechanism. Decentralized clearing mechanism. What's your name?
Caroline.
Caroline? So suppose that Caroline is selling some nice wool socks. I'm from Florida, so it's already getting a little cold up here for me, so I might be willing to buy some wool socks from Caroline. And perhaps she would accept cash for this transaction. Now that physical cash has some desirable properties that allow us to make this transaction. When I pull out that cash, Caroline can see that I actually own the cash. There's no doubt about that. I'm holding it in my hand. And when I transfer that cash to her, she knows that I am essentially debiting my account and crediting hers, right? So I'm transferring that balance to her. And crucially for the rest of you, once I relinquish that physical asset, I am no longer in a position to spend that asset again. I've transferred it to her, and so it's no longer in my possession. I can't use that as money now. Now, that mechanism doesn't really work so well with digital assets. So think about an MP3, right? If I transferred an MP3 to Caroline, well, in that case, I can transfer the music file without relinquishing ownership of the music file, right? She has the file and I have the file. So I could send that to someone else. We have what we call a double spending problem in that case. So when we're dealing with digital payments, we can't rely on this decentralized clearing mechanism where two parties to a transaction clear the transaction between them without reference to anyone else. Now, we've had digital payments before Bitcoin, right? But typically, for those digital payments, we've relied on a centralized clearing mechanism. So, where do you bank, Caroline?
South State.
South State. So suppose that we're both bank customers of South State. And instead of just paying Caroline in cash, I swipe my debit card or write a check or send her an electronic funds transfer. Right? Since we're both customers of South State, is that right? I'm not a customer of South State. Since we're both customers of the same bank, our bank clears this transaction for us. It processes the transaction. That is, the bank ensures that I have that balance of funds I'm trying to send. It debits my account and credits hers. And crucially, makes sure that I'm not in a position to spend that balance again. So it accomplishes the same kind of things that physical cash is able to accomplish in a digital environment. Now, I don't bank at your bank, of course. I bank somewhere else at Chase. But much the same thing happens, just at a higher level. So now there's a transaction between our two banks. And this transaction has to get cleared by Fedwire or the Clearinghouse Interbank Payment System, where my bank's account is debited and her bank's account is credited. But again, we have to process this transaction. And typically for a centralized, for a digital transaction, we're going to rely on this centralized clearing mechanism, where we trust some third party, right, this white node here in our crack, and we're going to route transactions through that third party. So now the transactions, it's no longer just happening between the two of us. Instead, it's happening through that third party. Bitcoin doesn't process transactions in either of these ways. It processes transactions in a new and different way. It processes transactions using a distributed clearing mechanism. We don't process the transactions just between the two of us, like we will with a decentralized clearing mechanism like cash. We don't process transactions through a trusted third party like we would with a check or debit card. Instead, if I were to pay Caroline with Bitcoin, the entire network of users running the Bitcoin protocol would process this transaction. That is, they would debit my account and credit hers. In brief, at the heart of Bitcoin is a shared ledger, the blockchain. And Bitcoin is a protocol for updating that ledger. When I make a transaction, all of the computers running the Bitcoin protocol begins racing to take this transaction and other transactions that have been made in the last 10 minutes or so and chain these to the block of transactions, or to keep with the analogy to ledgers, update this ledger reflecting that my sender account has been debited along with all the other sender accounts in that block of transactions, and the recipient's accounts have been credited. Right? We don't have to rely on any one third party to do that. Instead, the system as a whole is going to do this through the Bitcoin protocol. I'll say a bit more about that in a moment. All right, so you have a sense about what Bitcoin is. Let's think about why Bitcoin is valuable. What does it allow us to do? Why are people willing to pay for this? And sometimes when we want to think about the right explanation, it's helpful if we start with wrong explanations, particularly if those wrong explanations are common. So let's look at two not very satisfying explanations for why Bitcoin is valuable. The first explanation that you might encounter is that Bitcoin is valuable because it's costly to produce. Now, there's a grain of truth here. Bitcoin is costly to produce. So remember, I said that when I make a transaction, the entire network of users, they process that transaction. Well, it turns out that that's costly to do. And in order to encourage them to incur the cost of processing those transactions, the system rewards them with some new Bitcoin that never existed before. Right? So that's how the new Bitcoin enters the system. It's a reward for processing transactions, and it's costly to process transactions. Therefore, it's costly to produce. We can think of that transaction that I was describing earlier a bit more precisely. So what happens when I make a transaction? So suppose this is my transaction to Caroline. This transaction gets bundled together into a block of transactions with all the other transactions that have been taking place in the last 10 minutes or so. And then, you see, this is our previous blockchain here. Here's our proof of work, which says that this block is legitimate. So what these protocols are going to be doing is they're going to take this input here and create a hash. Right? They're going to hash this block. Right? So they put this into a function, and it spits out this new string of characters. And the system uses a proof of work mechanism. will recognize that this is a legitimate hash of this block, and therefore this batch of transactions will be chained to the previous block of transactions, which is chained to the previous, and so on and so forth, as our ledger is updated to reflect those most recent transactions. Only if this string of characters is an appropriate string of characters. Now, what does that mean? Well, it means that it has to have the right number, or it has to have at least as many leading zeros as our current difficulty level requires. This problem of hashing the block is actually very easy to do. It's not a complicated problem. And it could be accomplished at a very low cost. In fact, there are other mechanisms that use this, it's a similar blockchain technology called a proof of stake technology, that where this is very costly, it's not very costly to accomplish. Basically, under the proof of stake mechanism, we look at everyone holding the coins. Suppose there are 100 people, each holding one coin each. And so each person has a 1% chance, there's 1 in 100 of being selected. We choose one of those people randomly, given the size of their stake, and we say, you have been chosen, you hash this block. Right, that's very cheap, because then he just puts the hash function, the previous output becomes the input, he puts that into the hash function, we get a new input, solved. That's not the way Bitcoin does it. Instead, Bitcoin creates a competition to make this difficult to do. So searching for, producing a hash function is easy, but producing a hash function that has at least a given number of leading zeros is difficult, which means we might have to try this a few times. Many times, it turns out. Right? All of the computers running the protocol, it takes them about 10 minutes to find the right, inappropriate hash. And the reason we do that is because we want to make it random who processes this transaction. In particular, it's random where the probability that you process a batch of transactions is equal to the share of computing power you have on the Bitcoin system. Right? This turns out to be a pretty robust mechanism. It prevents me from processing my own transactions. It prevents me from authorizing a double spend, and so it makes this distributed clearing mechanism work. Now again, it's not the only way to have a distributed clearing mechanism. We can have a proof of stake mechanism, which puts the randomness before the hashing, but the proof of work mechanism that Bitcoin uses, the randomness is embedded in that hashing. How difficult is it? Well, remember that when someone processes a batch of transactions, some new Bitcoin is created. And so Bitcoin was designed so that new Bitcoin would be created at a steady rate. A new reward is issued roughly every 10 minutes. So around every 2 weeks, the system does a check and says, how are we doing? Are we processing transactions roughly once every 10 minutes? Or perhaps more quickly than that, or more slowly than that? If we're processing more quickly than that, the system automatically adjusts the number of leading zeros that are required, making it more difficult to solve this problem, slowing down the speed of block creation and therefore the increase in Bitcoin. If we're not solving this problem once every 10 minutes, then it will reduce the number of leading zeros, making this problem easier to solve so that we solve it more rapidly, and therefore new Bitcoin enters the system more frequently. So this is also this controlling the supply mechanism. So again, there's transactions that are made, they're bundled together, and then the computers on the system begin racing to update this blockchain, this shared ledger. And once an appropriate hash is found, that block of transactions is changed to the previous block of transactions, updating the shared ledger. So Bitcoin is clearly costly to produce. What's wrong with this explanation here? The cost isn't the source of the value. I tell my students, never reason from cost to value, always reason from value to cost. Now, cost and value are related, of course, and so sometimes it happens quite frequently where these ideas of cost and value, they get conflated. We'll say things like, well, you know why a doctor makes a lot of money? Because they spend so much time in school. But ask yourself, if a plumber spent as much time in school as a doctor, would a plumber make the same wage as a doctor? No, because what they're producing is plumbing services, right? It's the value that the doctor will be able to provide to their customers at the end of that long education that actually induces them to spend so much time incurring those skills, right? So it's not that the cost of going to school makes doctoring valuable. Rather, it's that the value of doctoring makes people incur the cost of going to school to provide those services. It's the same thing here. It's not that the cost of mining Bitcoin or producing Bitcoin makes Bitcoin valuable. Rather, it's because Bitcoin is valuable that people are willing to incur the costs required to process a batch of transactions and therefore receive the new Bitcoin that is created in the process. So again, Bitcoin is costly to produce, but that's not the source of the value. We need some other explanation to account for the value. Maybe the most popular explanation is that Bitcoin is valuable because of speculation. It's all just speculation. It's not based on anything. It's just unfounded speculation. And again, there's a grain of truth here. Is there speculation in the market for Bitcoin? Absolutely. It would be crazy if there weren't speculation in the market for Bitcoin. Because there's always speculation all of the time. Many of you are students, which means that you're speculating at the moment. I'm guessing that most of you decided to come here to get a degree and forego earning wages for hopefully 4 years, right? Why do you incur those costs? Well, because you expect, quite reasonably, that by getting this 4-year degree, you will be able to obtain a job that you wouldn't have been able to get without that degree. That job will have a higher wage or perhaps a set of characteristics that are more pleasant, right? And so you're speculating. Do you know what your wage is going to be when you finish? Do you know what job you're going to have? You don't know those things with any real degree of certainty, but you're forming a good guess about that future based on what you know about the world. And that's what we do in every market. We take the information that we have available and we make a good guess about the future. Yeah, that's speculation. What else do we do? Right? The future is unknown and unknowable, so there's nothing we can do but speculate. The insinuation here is that Bitcoin is really worth nothing, and so the price just jumps around because people are crazy or irrational, or they think that other people are crazy. I live in Florida, right? So I know a thing or two about other people being crazy. Right? Certainly, there are people out there who say and do crazy things all the time. But is that really what's driving these big fluctuations in the price of Bitcoin? I don't think so. There is some fundamental value of Bitcoin. Right? There is some usefulness to this asset, and people are willing to pay for that. So just imagine if I would have told you in, say, 2008, that I have invented this technology that allows you to transfer value virtually anywhere around the world, almost instantaneously, at a very low cost. Would you have really looked at me and said, worthless? Right? Not willing to pay anything for that? Probably not. Right? That seems like a valuable thing to do, to be able to transfer value virtually anywhere in the world, almost instantaneously at a very low cost. Oh, and by the way, without compromising your financial privacy. And that seems like a pretty valuable thing. So Bitcoin is valuable insofar as it's used as a medium of exchange, that is to transfer value, or is expected to be used as a medium of exchange at some point in the future. Now, we have other ways of using Bitcoin, we have other media of exchange that we can use to make transactions. And in many cases, those media of exchange are better than Bitcoin. Right, they have bigger networks of users, their purchasing power is more stable, they're familiar, I already have a lot of it, all right? And so why would I use this new thing, Bitcoin? But there are some transactions that are too cumbersome or too costly to make with traditional payment mechanisms. So take international remittances, for example. We have access to technology to make international remittances, to send funds to your family in Vietnam or Mexico or wherever they happen to be from. But we can do that for a fee. And the systems that we use to do that, like Western Union, they're kind of old. They use an older technology. So it'll take a couple days. It'll cost you not a non-trivial amount. What if you need that transaction there to be made instantaneously? Right? Maybe your aunt has just injured herself and she's on her way to the hospital and she doesn't have funds to pay the doctor in this remote village. Right? Western Union will take 3 days. Too late. Right? In that case, you probably want a payment mechanism that works very quickly. Or maybe you're making this remittance every month, and you don't want to pay a $20 fee every month to send $150. Right? And so you might want access to a payment technology that is relatively cheap to send across borders. Or maybe you value your financial privacy, perhaps because you're engaged in illegal activity. Right? You might not want to reveal that you're involved in those transactions. And so you probably shouldn't write a check. I'm originally from Ohio. We have a former mayor. You probably know him, but you probably don't know him as a former mayor. He was also a daytime television star named Jerry Springer. Jerry Springer once paid a hooker with a check. Now you might ask, how do you know? Because he paid her with a check. And soon everyone knew because there was a paper trail. Right? And so if you're involved in an illicit transaction, an illegal transaction, you might want to protect your financial privacy. It also turns out that some transactions are illegal, but most of us would say they're not wrong. So imagine if you support the opposition party in Venezuela. Probably not a good idea to support that party with your checking account. It's dangerous, not just for you, but for your family. You might want access to a payment technology that protects your privacy in that situation. Right? And so Bitcoin has a mix of characteristics that makes it well suited for some, but not all transactions. Some, but not all transactions. The problem in this space is that people commit what I like to call the all or nothing fallacy. Right? So folks who say Bitcoin is worthless, they say there's nothing that it's good for. Right? People who say to the moon, right? They think this is going to replace the dollar. But the range of reasonable is somewhere in between the two. It's recognizing that this has different features as a medium of exchange relative to other currencies we might use, other payment mechanisms we might use. And that makes it useful in some situations, but not all situations. Did you have a question here?
I did. I think some of the examples when you say it's very low cost to transfer in other elements is ignoring the complementary goods necessary for all of that to occur. So if it takes Western Union multiple days to get cash to an admittance, and you need it right away, it's a decent example, but we'd have to assume the doctor takes Bitcoin, that you have access to the internet, the blocks are playing well enough, and that the cost is being imposed through the high energy bills through Bitcoin, which is part of where people are willing to absorb the cost of mining because they're not paying the full cost. Society,
certainly
our
there-
environment, and other factors are, so to some extent, it's not a cheap technology like you're claiming. And if that person did get it, as many do, or even El Chivo and the Salvador wallets, have to go cash it out and find an ATM and usually pay a pretty high fee to transfer it back into something that maybe that doctor would take. So they're not paying it to Western Union, but unless the person actually will take it as a medium exchange, which is still pretty limited, you are paying a fee post-transfer.
Absolutely.
So it seemed like some of your examples are stretched a bit if you apply actual Bitcoin to that example of would that even be feasible?
So we
Like the
should make
advantage is there.
We should make a distinction between the private costs and benefits, which affects how an individual will value this, and potential social costs and benefits that might affect other decisions, like whether we should want people to use this technology. So any unaccounted for resource costs would fall into the latter category. All right, so we can just table those for now. They're important, but not relevant for this question. The question about the private valuation, you're right, Bitcoin has a small network of users at present. And so it's not as useful for doing those things that I've described as it would be if it had a large network of users. But that still doesn't mean that it's useless in those areas, because there are lots of people who are willing to function as intermediaries. And so
For a price.
I can send a balance of Bitcoin, and the recipient can receive their currency of choice. You mentioned El Salvador. El Salvador is kind of a terrible example because they were forced to accept Bitcoin. Most transactions that are taking place in Bitcoin are not compulsory transactions. They're transactions where people say, well, considering my options here, this is the better one. Right? And so in those transactions, by the very fact that they're engaged in them, it's indicating that it's better than their next best alternative as a private valuation. Again, holding aside any external costs or external benefits that might result from Bitcoin use. Okay, so the fundamental value of Bitcoin, again, is its usefulness as a medium of exchange today, or the second part, which is actually what I think is more important, the expectation that it will be useful as a medium of exchange at some point in the future. Now, we have some reason to think that there is some fundamental value of Bitcoin, but really that just tells us that, again, conditional on there being some fundamental value of Bitcoin, that just tells us that this asset will have a positive price. It doesn't tell us why that price would fluctuate so much. So we need to think a bit more about that fluctuation. Why is that purchasing power or that price of Bitcoin fluctuating so much? Let's go back to that fundamental value. And from that fundamental value, we can posit what might drive some fundamental fluctuation. Right, so if Bitcoin is useful as a medium of exchange, if Bitcoin's value depends on its usefulness as a medium of exchange, or the expectation that it will be useful as a medium of exchange in the future, then anything that changes its usefulness as a medium of exchange today, or the expectation that it will be useful as a medium of exchange in the future, will affect the price or the purchasing power of Bitcoin. Now, it turns out that we're dealing with currencies, this fundamental value idea, it gets a little complicated. How many of you have taken a finance class? All right, so you know how to value a bond, right? If you have a bond that has a face value, it matures in a year, right? You know what that future value is. You discount that future value, so you have to figure out what's the appropriate interest rate. And you discount any coupons along the way, and you have what the price of that asset is today. What about a stock, right? A stock is an ownership claim to a company. So you engage in a similar exercise. You need to think about what you get in the future, right? That stream of cash flows. And do you know what those cash flows are? Well, it's not like the face value of the bond, right? The company doesn't say, this is what our cash flows are going to be for the next 20 years, right? But you can estimate those cash flows. Right? You can come up with some good guesses about what those cash flows are likely to look like, and then discount those future cash flows in order to get an estimate of the price today.
Are you
Or-
saying a stock is a medium of exchange?
No, I'm saying it's an asset,
Okay,
and so we can value those assets. Since Bitcoin is a medium of exchange, when we value this asset, we need to think about what we get in the future. Well, it's not redeemable for anything else, right? So we don't have some face value at maturity. There are no future cash flows. Instead, what you get is its usefulness in the future, right? As a medium of exchange, those liquidity services, right? Now, if those liquidity services, if no one's going to use this in the future, then it's worthless in the future. And we would back out that it's worthless today. But if there's some chance that people will use this in the future, then we might be willing to hand over some goods and services today in order to have this asset that will be valuable in the future. Now, it turns out when we're dealing with currencies, this fluctuation can be pretty big, and for two reasons. First, because currencies, medium of exchange, are subject to network effects. It matters a lot how many people are in the network. Again, if no one is in the network, not a very useful money. Right? It's like being the only person who has a phone. Who are you going to call? Not very helpful. Right? And so that stream of liquidity services depends crucially on how many other people are in the network. If you have a lot of people in the network, it's a very valuable medium of exchange. If you have very few people in the network, it's not a very valuable medium of exchange. And so anything that affects our perception on that future network size is going to affect the usefulness as a medium of exchange in the future, which is going to affect the price of this asset in the future, and again, backing that out, the price of this asset today. Now, this is true of all currencies, right? We could say the same thing about the dollar. No one's going to use the dollar in the future, then there's not going to be a dollar network, and so no one's going to be willing to pay for that dollar in the future. And so, right, not a useful medium of exchange. But there's a pretty big difference, right? The government, the issuer of that dollar, is a pretty big player. And so for the monies we're more familiar with, like the dollar or the euro, there's some demand support there that the government provides. Some core network of use that most of us can be pretty confident is not going anywhere. Now, the periphery of that network could still contract, but it's not going to get any smaller than those government transactions. And as a result of that, there's a second layer there where people who are interacting with people who are involved in government transactions are likely to use the dollar. Right? And so that dollar network can also expand and contract, but it's basically bounded. Right? Bitcoin is not bounded like that. Its demand could go to zero. And there's no core demand support for Bitcoin like there is for the dollar. And so you have the potential for big changes in the network in the future, whereas for the dollar, you have small changes in the network in the future. So for Bitcoin, you can have some big changes in the price today, whereas for the dollar, you get relatively small changes in the purchasing power today. Right? So whenever we're thinking about the fluctuation of Bitcoin, we should ask ourselves, has there been a change in the usefulness of this asset today? Or has there been some change in the expectation of the network size or its usefulness in the future? All right, so here's a change in price. It happened about a year ago, almost a year ago. So here we have October 15th, 2020 to January 28th, 2021. Big run up in the price, as you can see. In October, around $12,000. By January, around $35,000 for one Bitcoin. That's a big change in the price of Bitcoin. Is there, maybe we just say, well, just speculation. And maybe there is some speculation that's driving this price change. But we should at least consider whether there's some big change in demand in this time period that might be able to account for some or all of this fluctuation in price. did anything happen in the world that made Bitcoin either more useful as a medium of exchange today, or made us expect that Bitcoin would have a bigger network of users and hence be more useful as a medium of exchange at some point in the future? It turns out something did happen. This is about to get a little awkward. I'm warning you in advance. I will tell you, the first time I raised this example, my dean was in the room. This is my boss's boss, and my wife was there as well. So this is awkward, but not as awkward as it was then. So there was a New York Times article in December 4th of 2020, called The Children of Pornhub. And in this article, the author, Nicholas Kristof, pointed out that this very popular website, Pornhub, was involved in some illegal and some illicit activities, right? Illegal and we'll say repugnant activities. So two claims here. We want to make sure we understand both of these claims. So the illegal, he said that there was some child pornography posted on this site. That's illegal. That there was some revenge pornography in some jurisdictions. That's illegal. But he also made the charge that there was some repugnant activity hosted on this site. Misogynist content, racist content. And so there's two claims here. I want to make sure we understand that there are two claims here. That it was illegal and repugnant. Now, the response was swift. If you went onto Twitter, you would see that the activist investor Bill Ackman, he was saying, this is terrible. Visa, MasterCard, and American Express should stop processing payments on Pornhub. And Nicholas Kristof retweeted this, which unfortunately shows that the New York Times here needed to do a little more fact-checking. American Express wasn't processing payments for Pornhub or any other adult website out of policy, a long-standing policy that they had. It should have been American Express, it should have been MasterCard, Visa, and Discover. This was quickly realized. And the credit card processors, they quickly replied, right? MasterCard here on December 10th says it's going to stop processing payments for Pornhub. Bill Ackman says, how about you, Visa? And Visa soon replied, and Discover followed. So shortly, just very shortly after this article appears in the New York Times, all of the traditional payment processors for Pornhub cuts them off. This website is cut off from the traditional payment processing system. Now, maybe you think this is a good thing, or maybe you think this is a bad thing. That's a normative question, right? Because you might say, look, if they're involved in these illegal activities, then we don't want payment processors to facilitate those transactions, so it's great that we can cut them off. Or if you're on the other side of this issue, you might respond, well, sure, but we should take them to court. We should have some kind of a ruling, not just an article in the New York Times. Or maybe you would even go so far to say, I don't care if it's illegal. It was repugnant activities on this site. We shouldn't have that being processed either. Right? Or maybe you say, to each his own. It doesn't matter whether you think this is a good thing or a bad thing. Right? We just need to recognize that it's a thing, that it happened. And when I said that Pornhub was cut off by all the traditional financial payment processors, I chose my terms carefully there because you could still subscribe to Pornhub with Bitcoin and 13 other cryptocurrencies. So when did this happen? Well, right there before the price shot up. So what's going on here? What am I actually arguing? Am I suggesting that people suddenly started flocking to Bitcoin so that they could renew their Pornhub subscriptions? No, that's not actually my claim. I think that direct source of demand in this case was actually very limited. I don't know much about their subscriber pool, but I'm guessing it's not big enough to explain this big of an increase in the price of Bitcoin. What's more likely, I think, is that there was a big change in, there was an indirect effect from this event. That is, prior to December 10th, most Americans, most people around the world, never really thought that the big American payment processors could just cut off a business without a court order. It just wasn't something that occurred to them. And then suddenly there are all these stories about this happening, and they realize, wait a second, this can happen. And for many of these people, they don't visit Pornhub, they're certainly not members, but they think, wait a second, if this can happen to this business, it can happen to other businesses. And maybe some of those people, they think, I might not even use those businesses ever. But still, they recognize that a medium of exchange that promotes financial privacy is more likely to be used, to be found to be useful in the future than they had previously. Because they didn't realize there was this risk of being cut off before, and now it was very salient, very clear. Now, on top of this, right, there are other examples that are additional information shocks that are rolling in around this time. Right, we have the Twitter and Facebook coming under heat for kicking people off of their platform, which kind of reiterates this narrative that big platforms have a lot of control, and you might want access to a payment technology that can circumvent those platforms in the future. Right? To the extent that that's the case, we should expect that a cryptocurrency like Bitcoin is more likely to be found useful in the future. If more people are likely to use it in the future, then we should expect that it will be more valuable in the future. And if it's more valuable in the future, we should expect its price to rise today. That's exactly what we see in the time series. Now, we could go through lots of price shocks. There have been a ton in the last year. Most recently, China basically bans Bitcoin entirely. Right? Just prior to that, it had banned Bitcoin mining. And a couple years before that, it had prevented any of its banks and financial institutions from holding cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin, or even pricing their assets in cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin. India recently announced that it was going to introduce a central bank digital currency, and in line with that, it was going to ban alternatives to that central bank digital currency, alternatives like Bitcoin. Well, if you have India and China, two very populous countries, right, if you think that it's going to be very difficult for people in those countries to get and use Bitcoin in the future, right, that means the network of future users is probably going to be smaller. Right, and so the price comes down. India, right, quickly backed off of this. We have another information shock. Right now we think maybe it won't be so hard to access this in India. And all the time there's new information that is coming about how useful or not useful this asset might be in the future for making transactions. And every time we get that new information, people are updating their expectations of that future network size, and the price moves as a result. Is some of this driven by speculation? Certainly. Right? People make mistakes. I know, it's shocking, right? But a big chunk of this fluctuation seems pretty easy to explain with just underlying market fundamentals, once you're thinking about this asset as a medium of exchange. All right, I look forward to your questions.
Yeah, so there's getting close to 6,000 different cryptocurrencies. So how do we know that Bitcoin that the market won't become too saturated, or that the government will be forced to do some kind of regulations, or that Bitcoin's technology being the first is probably the most outdated?
Yeah, so here are the top 10 cryptocurrencies by market capitalization. So number 2 there, Ethereum, is perhaps the one we should pay the most attention to. Bitcoin's market capitalization, that is its price times the number of coins outstanding. So this is a measure of the demand to hold this asset. That market capitalization has been increasing over time, on average. But if you were to add up the market capitalization of all 6,000, I think it's like 5,800 something. But if you were to add up the market capitalization of all of those and then look at the Bitcoin share of that market, Bitcoin actually has a smaller share of that total cryptocurrency market today than it had a year ago or a year before that. And in particularly, Ethereum is gaining a bigger share. So although both Ethereum and Bitcoin, they're increasing their market capitalization, Ethereum is doing so more rapidly, is ending up with a bigger share of this market, even though Bitcoin is clearly dominant.
What's that gonna do to the networks though? Because now, if, let's say I have Ethereum and you have Bitcoin, aren't we gonna need some kind of middle party to figure that out?
That's right, so if Ethereum becomes more popular, all else equal, right, then this eats away at the future network of Bitcoin, right? So that looks like a negative shock for Bitcoin. We have a positive shock for Ethereum. These are competitors, right? Now, Ethereum has a second mover advantage, right? In fact, all of these altcoins have a second mover advantage. That is, they can look at things that people didn't quite like about Bitcoin or things that Bitcoin perhaps can do, but not as well because it wasn't designed specifically to do this. And then someone can introduce a new cryptocurrency that does that thing where Bitcoin is lacking. That's what Ethereum does. It's very good at making smart contracts, for example. So we might have a contract that references some observable market, like maybe the market price for West Texas crude. And then we write a digital contract. So perhaps we both put in $100 worth of Ethereum into this contract. And then we say, if on Friday the price of this barrel of oil on this reference market is greater than, say, $80 a barrel, then you get the $200. And if it's $80 or less, then I get the $200. And we don't have to worry about this going to a third-party arbitrator or me failing to pay out this contract because the contract is self-executing. It references that market and then automatically transfers the funds that we have designated to the rightful recipient. That's kind of a cool technology, right? And this is maybe just one of the simplest kind of smart contracts that we can write with Ethereum. So, right, that looks very good for the prospects of Ethereum, and correspondingly, it calls into doubt the prospects for Bitcoin. And why would we use this old technology and not this better technology? You also see this with the proof of work versus proof of stake clearing blockchain mechanism that I was describing earlier. So Ethereum is in the process of transitioning from proof of work to proof of stake. One reason is because it's cheaper to process transactions using a proof of stake. Why didn't Bitcoin use proof of stake? Well, because we didn't know about proof of stake when Bitcoin was created. And Bitcoin has a decentralized governance structure, whereas Ethereum has a leader. And so it's much easier for Ethereum to make this change than it is for Bitcoin. So that's another feather in Ethereum's cap at the expense of Bitcoin. But Bitcoin, it lacks that second mover advantage, but it has a first mover advantage. And that first mover advantage is that if you've only heard of one cryptocurrency, it's almost certainly Bitcoin. We're talking about medium of exchange here. You don't just choose the medium of exchange that you like the most, you choose the medium of exchange that you think other people are going to be using, because if other people aren't using it, it's not very useful. The network for Bitcoin is the big network, right? And so it's really hard to overcome that network effect, which is benefiting Bitcoin to the expense of these other upstarts at the moment. So this is a battle, right, between this first mover advantage and the second mover advantage, and it's not clear how that's going to
By
play
that
out.
same logic, then why they're 5,800? Like, eventually, some of them got to believe they're never going to have a big enough network in the future to matter.
So perhaps some of this is chasing after niche uses, right? So take Ripple, for example, XRP here, number 6 on the list. Ripple has gone a different way. They're a private company, right? And so they've said from the outset, we're gonna do our best to comply with regulations that haven't even been written yet, but we're going to do our best to figure out how we're likely to be treated by the regulators and comply with those, which makes it much more convenient for business-to-business transactions. Is Ripple trying to compete with Bitcoin? Well, not for retail transactions. They're just trying to carve out a small corner of the business-to-business transactions, right? And so they've developed this special purpose coin, right, that will probably have a smaller market capitalization than whatever the big winner is in this space, but will nonetheless be valuable, right, and be useful in some niche applications. Right, and so we could go through, so Tether, for example. Tether is a stable coin, and it's one of the complaints with Bitcoin is that its value fluctuates a lot, which makes it riskier to hold than if its value didn't fluctuate a lot. So Tether says, you want all the transactions benefits of Bitcoin without the fluctuation? We can deliver that. We will target the price of the dollar. And so one Tether trades very closely to $1 at any point in time. And the Tether company adjusts the supply of Tether in circulation to ensure that that peg is targeted relatively closely. And so again, you know, if you're interested in having an appreciating currency, Tether's not for you, right? But if you're interested in having a very stable currency, then that's a better alternative than Bitcoin. Yeah, so I see a lot of niche uses in this space.
So for Bitcoin to function as a medium of exchange, or any crypto for that matter, how important is it for goods and services to be denominated in Bitcoin? So for instance, you know, I want to go buy coffee in Bitcoin. My salary has to be converted from dollars to Bitcoin, and then the coffee itself has to be priced in Bitcoin. And that's not really the case.
You're right. It's not the case that prices are routinely priced, that goods are routinely priced in Bitcoin. Typically, the way pricing works is that prices are, goods are priced in dollars, and then you're presented with the Bitcoin equivalent at the current exchange rate, right? You know, if this functioned as a unit of account as well, that would be great. It would make it a little bit easier to transact, but its value is very volatile, which makes it cumbersome to use as a primary unit of account. And so even when goods and services are priced in Bitcoin, it's really just instantly or near instantly updated conversion of the dollar price and the dollar exchange to Bitcoin, right? So you're right, it doesn't function very well as a unit of account. It's really only serving as a medium of exchange here. I think most of us and most of our transactions like to have a unit of account that is the same as our medium of exchange. That's a desirable thing for those things to line up. Is it a necessary condition? No. It doesn't have to function as a unit of account in order to be useful as a medium of exchange. But it probably suggests that for most of our transactions, we will not be using Bitcoin because of its volatility and the high cost of using it as a unit of account.
But when we think about currency as a definition, unit of account falls under that. So it's sort of inappropriate to talk about Bitcoin as currency.
Well,
It doesn't meet all the requirements of currency. It really only meets medium in exchange. And even then, it's still all pegged in dollars. Even the Pornhub site you showed didn't say 0.00001 of a Bitcoin. It said
So that's-
999.
so you hear people say this a lot, that an item has to be a unit of account in order to be a currency. But if you just open up a money and banking textbook, economists define a currency, as a commonly accepted medium of exchange. Now, in the very next line, it will say that monies typically function as a store of value, a medium of exchange, and a unit of account. But those aren't necessary conditions, except for in the case of medium of exchange. And the store of value function is really trivial, because that just means that it's an asset, right? We have examples of other monies that didn't function as a unit of account. My favorite example is from Brazil. So in Brazil, they were dealing with hyperinflation, and they had a currency called the Cruzeiro. And of course, prices in Cruciero had to be changed very frequently because they're experiencing hyperinflation. So the government comes up with an idea. They are going to introduce this new asset, the Unidad Real Valor, the unit of real value. And every day the central bank would announce the market exchange rate between the Cruciero and the URV. And so naturally, shopkeepers price their goods and services in terms of the stable URV, but not a single person made purchases with the URV. You might wonder, how am I so confident that not a single person made purchases with the URV? It's really quite easy, because the URV didn't exist. It was just a unit of account. When you went into a store, you couldn't pay with URV because there were no URVs. You had to pay with Cruciero. So you would see these prices in URV, you would get up to the till, and you would hand over Cruciero at the current exchange rate. And this enabled shopkeepers to change their price just once a day instead of several times throughout the day, and slowed down the inflation that was being experienced. Right, so here we have a case where the Cruciero is continuing to function as money. It's a commonly accepted medium of exchange, but it's not functioning as a unit of account. Right? The URV is functioning as a unit of account.
I know that there are several more questions, but we're already 5 minutes after 6, so I'm gonna go ahead and stop the formal lecture. So thank you, Dr. Luther, for sharing your thoughts and information on Bitcoin, but please feel free to hang around and ask additional questions, and thank you guys for coming.
My pleasure.
Lisa, so grab some on the way out, please. Oh, and if you're in my class and you haven't signed up, please go ahead and sign up as a sign-in sheet, and if you didn't sign in,